for the Reclaim Network Plus webinar series. So this is webinar number 23. If you're not aware of the Reclaim Network, so this is a Network Plus which is funded by the UKRI by 3 councils, NERC, PSRC and AHRC, and there are the 5 collaborating the institutes, the universities are included in it. So this webinar series, if you can go next, please. So this is basically the team of the representatives from the 5, the universities, institutes I was talking about, and supported by our network manager and project officer and the network fellow. The network has grown quite substantially over the years. So currently we got around 584 members, and they represent over 45 countries. And they come from, the variety of the areas, like you can see on the figure there, starting from research to the students, to the NGOs and consultancy services, and so on. And they had a varied interest in terms of the public health and well-being, looking at the planning and governance, trees, green roofs, green walls, and so on. So it's a pretty kind of, the wider the network, and we got the network area where you can get access to the network members, if you are a member of the network. If you are not, then we'll post the link in the chat box and you are welcome to join the network. This webinar series is run every month, usually on Wednesday, the first Wednesday of every month between 12:30 and 13:30, and we have managed to do 22 webinars so far. And all these webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So I will post the link if you are interested to look at the previous recordings. You can have a look at them. And if you want to know a little bit more about the network or any questions you have, just write to the info@reclaimnetwork.org. So today we have a pleasure of having 2 of our distinguished speakers. So the first one is Tom Wild. He's a principal investigator for the Conexus project. So he comes from the University of Sheffield in the Department of Landscape Architecture. Tom is ecologist, specializing in aquatic and riparian ecosystems and catchment management practices. And his research interests center around the conditions, policies, and practices that enable or hinder the rehabilitation and regeneration of impacted ecosystems. Much of his work has been cornered with values and economic valuation of green-blue infrastructure and nature-based solutions, such as sustainable urban design and decultivating and river restoration. So before I hand over to Tom, just to give you some the housekeeping notes. So there will be the questions after these 2 presentations. So each presentation will be 20 minutes. And the session will be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Thomas Kjeldsen from University of Bath. And if I can request you to write your use the Q&A button and write your questions there. So Thomas will pick them up and present to the speakers. If you want your questions to be read with your name and affiliation, please write your name and affiliation with your question as well. So these recordings, these webinars are recorded. So, and they will be made available later on in case if you find, if you want to share with your colleagues later on, and if they can't join this, this session today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tom.
That's great. Many thanks, Prashant. Many thanks, Charlotte and Louise and Thomas. I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully everything will work okay. Can you tell me if you can see my screen okay?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, so wonderful. Yeah, I'm Tom Wild. I'm based in the Department of Landscape Architecture, and I'm the principal investigator and coordinator of the Horizon 2020 Conexus project on urban nature-based solutions. It's a 4-year project, 5 million euros, with 33 partners in Latin America and in Europe, with 7 cities. I'll be talking today about the valuation and impacts, particularly of urban nature-based solutions. And in particular, thinking through why are valuations and impacts important, what gaps our research is addressing, some of the methodologies, and then findings, conclusions and impacts, and then where next with the work. But before that, it'd be helpful just to talk about the definition for nature-based solutions, and here in particular the UNEA adopted definition. I've shown the link as well, but it's a short video produced by the Conexus project, also gives a little bit of background, and hopefully you'll hear the sound. So we'll move on. Are you hearing this okay? Okay, so I hope you could hear that over the wind. It's quite a windy day here today in Sheffield. The reason I'm showing that is partly to stress, obviously, that nature-based solutions depend on and must enhance biodiversity and ecological integrity, as well as providing social protections and enhancing and supporting cultural heritage. But they also have obviously economic impacts and benefits, and this is where valuation really starts to come in. And this came to the fore in around 21-22 through a series of reports through the Climate Policy Initiative and the World Resources Institute and others, demonstrating that relatively small amount of funding is going towards urban adaptation, less than 0.1%. Of all total adaptation finance landing in cities, and particularly small amounts of that for nature-based solutions. So only 1% of climate overseas development aid is going for nature-based solutions, and that includes rural areas. Now, if you look at the Green Earth and Green Finance reports as well, you find that the vast majority of this funding and project work is actually going into rural areas, not into urban locations. And Masters has stressed here, Masters et al. Has stressed that demonstrable performance metrics should in theory be able to increase private sector participation and unlock new and diverse funding streams. And Natalie Seddon's group have also kind of echoed this, that private climate finance is increasingly directed towards MBS. Now, that contrasts quite sharply with Dempsey and Suarez findings from 2016 that despite the exploding rhetoric around environmental markets over the last 2 decades, the capital flowing into market-based conservation remains small. It will be interesting to see whether the current range of activities around natural capital leads to new funding, and particularly in urban areas. So those are the kind of background issues that supported our research proposal, and particularly the paper I'll be presenting now, addressing some key gaps and questions. And in particular, Cinnamon Dobbs and Alexis Vasquez in Latin America have stressed that a lack of economic valuation of nature-based solutions benefits has remained a barrier to development and implementation. Echoing Kim Whitehoke's work for the European Commission and myself and others, the data on the NBS values and on the prices side remains rare. The other factor, of course, being that values and costs are vital in discussions with stakeholders around viability of NBS, particularly in urban planning contexts. But does that mean necessarily that valuation methodologies haven't been developed or aren't available? Well, Croce et al. In 21 suggested that economic valuations of urban ecosystem services are rare in the literature, and I think that can be questioned because here we pursued quite a range of projects on economic valuation of blue-green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. This is just one of the publications from a set of projects between, say, 2008 and 2020. So I think the question more is not whether the valuation tools exist, but how have they been applied to understand the economic impact, and particularly of urban nature-based solutions? And how do the valuations that are undertaken relate to other impact assessment frameworks and indicators, such as the European Commission's Impact Assessment Handbook, the Dimitri and Wendling report, and also the Eclipse framework? And critically, is there evidence of cities taking up these methods? And that's the fundamental part of our paper produced this year with a range of colleagues, and I've left the link there from the Urban Forestry and Urban Greening paper. How we've undertaken this work is through mixed methods, really. So systematic literature review to find out what valuation methods have been applied to urban NBS and understand the links between the indicators and values. We undertook focus groups with city staff to establish which valuation methods fitted best in different contexts. And through that kind of transdisciplinary approach, then moving on to semi-structured interviews with staff to understand if and how valuations are applied in practice. What we found through that is indeed that there's a massive amount of literature on valuation methods now that have been applied to urban NBS. We started off with 900 plus documents. Many of those, though, weren't related to urban or not strictly NBS, or they weren't monetary valuation or not based on empirical work. But despite that, we were able to do full review of nearly 300 papers, peer-reviewed papers. And that led to valuation studies, full set of references covering a wide range of valuation techniques applied specifically in the urban area for nature-based solutions. We wanted to know more, so we drilled into case studies of how valuations had been applied, over 200 cases, drawing on the work of Juan David Amaya Espinel in the Conexus project. We looked at these reported case studies from many cities and found that over 50 different types of indicators had been reported, and this material is all available through the paper. But very few of those assessments had carried out what you might call a comprehensive or holistic assessment. Most just addressed 2 or 3 co-benefits or indicators. We also found that there was a kind of clustering of topics and themes for impacts associated with particular types of intervention. So valuation of urban trees strongly linked with air quality, heat, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and so on. And probably the most useful thing here was that we were able to generate a sense of which were the themes that were being most regularly valued monetarily. And they're tree cover, vegetation cover, recreation, aesthetics, air quality and air pollution, biodiversity and other related issues, flood risk management, and then separate to that, runoff of urban water in terms of flow, retention, detention, heat and urban heat island effects, carbon storage and sequestration, mitigation, and socioeconomic status and deprivation. Now, what's interesting there is that primarily those indicators are physical environmental in nature. Most of them are anyway. And when we started to discuss in the focus groups with the city staff in Sao Paulo in May 2022, we found a slightly different picture. So we held a Menti poll with nearly 100 people participating, and what came out very strongly from that, when we asked what were the impact indicators that cities found to be the most important aspects, the social themes and the kind of process issues came to the fore: participation, governance, social inclusion, co-creation, cohesion. These themes became very strongly represented. And so comparing those topics together with the MBS Impact Assessment Handbook of the European Commission, the Dimitri and Wendling report, as I mentioned, we were able to cluster the indicators together across the 12 what are called societal challenge themes. And rather than looking into all of these data, I just wanted to drag your attention towards those 3 here that are around social capacities, participation, social justice. And here you can see there's a very distinct difference. There's very, very few monetary valuation studies tackling those topics. So that points towards a gap. Moving on to the semi-structured interviews and the discussions with cities, I've just pulled out 3 or 4 quotes here. So from Santiago de Chile, participants said that if the monetary valuation leaves out the main issue, the improvement of ecosystem and ecological enhancement, then it was kind of missing the point. And similarly from Bogota, I can't simply arrive and make an economic assessment without also knowing how it is at the social level, without knowing how it is at the ecological level. In other words, the other data and impact assessment protocols. Buenos Aires stressed that the problem they encountered was the availability of data to make those evaluations. And again, this links with an issue that was flagged in Bogota, that the tools themselves can be pretty complex, not a tool that everyone knows how to use. Despite that, we found that the Conexus of access to green space. So some key points then from those cities. Well, what comes across is that valuations can be very useful indeed if they're combined with other data and other impacts assessments. But cities understand the risks of monetization. Then they have a nuanced understanding of the indirect elements of the issues around putting a value on nature, which I think is perhaps less obvious than in urban areas than it is in rural areas like tropical rainforests and so on, but still is a cause of concern, and particularly in relation to biodiversity and ecological impacts, which are essential to MBS. People had strong knowledge of valuation methods, the purpose and the benefits, but they may lack the capacity to apply the tool, most importantly because of the lack of data on impacts. Where next then? Well, the obvious thing is when we look at this handbook, there is a significant area that could be looked at again in terms of those valuation methodologies. Now, 2 or 3 of the themes are strongly related to economic values, and yet the methods in the appendix of particular detailed methods miss these different techniques. So that's an area where we're working with the relevant EC task forces to improve things. But when we do so, it's important to stress that the valuations, the nature-based solutions indicators and their impacts, and the evaluations we apply to them really need to resonate with the city, the citizens, and the context of the problems to which they respond. In short, MBS aren't modular. They're based on biodiversity and local ecosystems, and those all differ, as well as for sociocultural reasons. Cities aren't like cars. They're not all the same, and an off-the-shelf model won't work for the MBS itself, for the impact assessment, or the valuation methods. And illustrating that with my own city of Sheffield, this is how it used to look, dominated by steel industry and collieries, large, high-density development of industrial land, and then obviously through the 1980s, economic restructuring, the time of Margaret Thatcher, a surfeit of brownfield land and vacant derelict land strongly influenced what is possible, but also the development dynamics and the economic opportunities for MBS. So how do we move forward? Well, I think the answer to this is partly in a participatory approach to setting the indicator topics, as well as an aligned valuation methodology. So this work that we've been doing to develop more participatory approaches to monitoring and impact assessment equally can apply to economic valuation. I'll just finish with the take-home messages. The overcomplicating the frameworks for valuation and for funding linked with economic valuation is really unrealistic and unhelpful to cities, and especially so for small community-led initiatives and in deprived districts or in low to middle income countries. We found that the methods do exist and they are applied in comparison with Croce et al.'s findings, but we need to stress that there's less potential for wide scope city scale evaluations where we have to face the fact that land is more fragmented under different ownership, and for instance the GIS-based methodologies that may work very well in rural settings perhaps transfer less easily to urban settings. So we need better impact data, and I would say the key thing is more knowledge exchange with cities and city staff, and that's the place of these kind of networks and these exchanges like Reclaim is organising. So I will end there and thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to seeing the questions and just point you towards our website and links, and I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. This is a very important topic, and as you rightly kind of emphasized, is understudied. So this is a very useful, the work and the papers you have done would be very useful for the colleagues actually to follow. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce to our second speaker of the day today, and it's Dr. Louise Firth. She's a marine ecologist and lecturer at University College Cork. She's a globally recognized expert on applying nature-based solutions to artificial structures in the marine environment. Her research focusing on understanding the ecology of the marine built environment, and she's particularly interested in developing novel ways of making space for nature in human-dominated environments. Over to you, Louise.
You're on mute, Louise.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
I was on mute.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Oh, sorry. Oh, how many times have we done this? Sorry. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. As we're all very much aware, we are transforming the global coastline. We are replacing natural habitats with a range of different artificial structures, ranging from small scale groynes like the top picture here to harbour infrastructure like the bottom left, to whole artificial islands like the palms, which I'm sure we're all very well aware of in the Middle East. Globally speaking, a survey came out from 2021, and very much an underestimation, I think, but the global footprint of marine construction spans about 32,000 square kilometres and over 479 artificial islands globally. Of course, all of this artificialization of the coastline is driving the loss of species, their habitats, all of the necessary functions and services that are provided to humans. Given the audience here today, I don't think I need to speak too much about that. But with this artificialization of the coastline, we're replacing natural habitats. And of course, natural habitats have many different species, many different functions. And of course, this will lead to healthier, more resilient systems. I work in a coastal setting where we're working on marine artificial structures. So natural rocky shores are the most analogous natural system that we tend to deal with. And of course, you have all sorts of species ranging from seaweeds, which can produce oxygen, habitat and food, sponges, mussels, which are water filtrators and they can contribute to water quality. Mussels, of course, are food, not just for organisms, but also can be for humans. And many of the algae, of course, have very important services in terms of carbon sequestration and storage. By replacing natural rocky shores and, of course, other natural environments with coastal infrastructure, we are seeing a biotic and functional homogenization of these environments. We're seeing fewer species, and of course with fewer functions. And of course, all of this is linking to much less resilient systems. And of course, part of that argument, we are seeing many more invasive species colonizing these structures as well. And the same species are cropping up in many different parts of the world. So we're seeing this biotic and functional homogenization at very large spatial scales. So I work in a field called well, ecological engineering, or greening the grey. There are many different terms for it now. And it's a relatively new field in comparison to Tom working in terrestrial environments. This is very much behind, and we're very much playing catch up with the terrestrial world. But just to show you some examples of some of the GBGI, green, blue, grey infrastructure that's been going on. Many people, of course, are working with concrete and materials. Concrete, of course, is one of the most prevalent materials used in all sorts of environments, but people are working at many different scales, from working with the aggregates and the pH level of the material itself, to designing precast units like this bioblock here that we produce here in the middle image. The idea behind the bioblock is it has many different habitats to make space for nature. And in a few examples, this one here is from Seattle on the west coast of the United States. There are some large-scale installations. These are very, very rare. There are only a handful of these globally. But you can see here, this is quite a large installation here. You have this concrete facade on the seawall with lots of different complexities and overhangs and different habitat types. But this is part of a much larger scale citywide regeneration project that has many different habitats and ecosystems spread throughout. So this slide is really just dealing with what we can do when it comes to working with concrete itself. But of course, there are many different types of GBGI that people have been trialing in different contexts. Just like on land, we can plant or transplant desirable species, and in the marine environment, we have been doing a little bit of that, not a huge amount to date, particularly working with desirable algal species. People are retrofitting desirable habitats onto things like seawalls and coastal rock armouring. And where space allows it, these sort of hybrid designs are being trialled that are softening the interface between land and sea and making space for nature in that sphere. So I just want to talk specifically about a project that is linked to the funding that we got from Reclaim that was in Plymouth. The original project came from Sydney. So this is an image showing you the living seawall. Just like living walls on land, we're now beginning to deploy these kind of things in the marine environment. And you can see here, there's lots of different concrete panels with different textures and habitat types. And the idea behind it is different species will colonize the different panels, creating a mosaic of species and the various functions and services. First one was deployed in Sydney in 2018. There are now many different installations all around Sydney testing different panel types. But we were lucky enough to get some funding in Plymouth to be able to deploy a replica of one of the types of installations that they have in Sydney. And the idea behind this is we're hoping this is the beginning of what will become a global network, trialing the exact same installation in different environmental settings to test for generality. Because I think it's safe to say that we all know that just because something works in one place doesn't mean to say that it will work in different places. So ours was deployed in August 2023, and you can see the early stages of it on the slide in front of you. Just some images of some of the life that has begun to colonize. Fucoid algae are now growing quite well on the structure, and it's turned from green to brown more recently. And there are many species beginning to colonize over time. This will be a long-term process, and we will be monitoring that through PhD student Franz Bauer, who's based at the University of Plymouth. He'll be looking at the biological monitoring, and Jess Allen, PhD student, is looking at the social perceptions and people's understanding and appreciation of the structure and the various ecosystem services associated with it. So Reclaim very kindly funded a workshop which we had in October last year, and the idea behind it was really to bring stakeholders together, share knowledge, and gather critical information with having all of these stakeholders and experts in the room. It's at the early stages of this, but the idea behind this is that the information that we're going to gather, that we did gather from that workshop, would generate a synthetic review of how GBGI can integrate human and natural capital to assess a suite of well-being benefits to people. Jess Allen will be the one leading that, but just to sort of give you a sense of how the workshop actually ran, we had 3 sections to it. The first section was a round of short talks by very carefully selected stakeholders and bodies that we were interested to get their thoughts on GBGI. And I'm not going to read out the full list here, but you can see we had people ranging from council to artists, industry, engineers, educators, and researchers, to name but a few. The second part of the workshop entailed a roundtable discussion where people were given a set of questions and then they had to feedback the questions to a panel at the end, and we were gathering all of the information from that. And this, of course, was followed by a field trip to the Living Seawall where people were able to look at it in situ. You can see it's very green during the workshop. If we were to visit that today, it would be quite brown because of the fucoid algae. But just some very general findings from the workshop. This is still very much in process. People were aware of GBGI and the various services that it can provide. But just like Tom was suggesting, often these are difficult to quantify, and there are many different ways that this can be done. There was general sort of consensus between the group in terms of the various types of services that GBGI on marine infrastructure can provide. But importantly, they highlighted that there were various barriers to the implementation. And I've got at the next slide, we'll go into some of the barriers to this in a little bit more detail. One thing that really came out in the conversation was the trade-off between the cultural benefits to humans and the ecological benefits. So it's not necessarily a simple balance, and there are trade-offs for one or the other, depending on how we do things. And one thing that really came out was that there are some fears that GBGI could be used as a sort of a Trojan horse, effectively, for enabling harmful developments to possibly go ahead. So there was concern that it might be misused by industry. So in terms of the barriers and challenges, and I know this is something that Tom highlighted as well, I won't read this in complete detail, but lack of evidence. As I said, this is a very young field in the marine environment, and to date, there isn't a huge amount of evidence out there. So this was something that came up in this discussion. Monitoring of this kind of installation, sometimes it does actually require disturbing the wildlife. So there are concerns about the necessary knock-on effects on the environment and through just the monitoring of it. The inconsistencies in terms of, if we deploy these GBGI installations, the outcomes are difficult to predict, and that sort of links to the lack of the evidence base as well. Sometimes they can be very difficult and expensive to install at scale. The example I showed you is probably one of the larger scale installations that we have, certainly in the UK. But if you look at it in context, it's very much a small scale intervention. Public safety came up as a major concern, particularly with people working on local councils. And of course, this is something that is a real fear. I certainly had this fear when we were installing our seawall. The licensing, it was something that came up, and speaking to other people who work in this sphere, this is a constant concern that comes up. And sometimes it's not always clear whether you actually need to get a license or not. Certainly in my experience, when it came to applying for licenses for this, ours was classed as a development rather than an enhancement. And if it's an enhancement, it doesn't need a license. If it's a development, it does. You've seen the seawall. You can make your own judgments about whether you think that that's an actual development or not. Obviously, the example that I just showed you involves concrete, and of course there are all sorts of concerns about the carbon footprint balance versus the environmental benefits when it comes to working with concrete, and the ongoing maintenance of putting such structures in the marine environment. It's a very difficult environment to work when it comes to storm damage, for instance, and all sorts of marine maintenance is required in that kind of environment. So this was something that was a concern in terms of who is responsible for doing this. So moving forward, that was just the workshop, and we obviously want to do something with this. Jess Allen is going to be the person very much driving this forward. Her PhD is a broader PhD, thinking about the ecosystem services of marine structures and rocky shores generally, but how GBGI can also feed into ecosystem service provision. And she's going to be taking the information from this workshop, and she's going to be feeding it into chapters from her PhD, but of course they will in turn turn into papers as well. So that is very much work in progress. And I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to the Reclaim Network for funding the workshop and enabling this to happen, and also to everyone for being here and listening to my talk today. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Louise. I think this is, as you rightly said, it's a very important area, and there is not a lot of research in this particular area. So yeah, great work actually, and continue doing the good job. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Thomas to take over for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Prashant. Thank you to both speakers for very interesting talks. We've had a few questions, but I think we have time for more than the ones we have. So if you have any, just pile in. So first question is to Tom. So Tom, here's a question that says that trees came up. That's something in your talk as something people value to have within cities. Do you think the perception would vary if they knew about whether particular species were invasive and other impacts these trees might have?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hot topic in a department like mine, where people are recommending particular tree species for planting in urban areas, and where climate change is hugely impacting on what is the kind of palette of tree species. I mean, Henrik Sjöman's been working on this topic, produced a really nice book about it in the UK context. Fundamentally, I think it has been an issue in the past. It's likely to become more of a topic because of the uncertainty about how current tree populations will respond to climate change, and therefore the gaps, both in the urban and rural environment, and people trialling and experimenting with planting new trees. And linked with that, of course, is the issue of allergenicity, and more of us are suffering from allergens. Whether there's any kind of link between the climate and people's responses to those different tree species. I mean, it seems that people have allergenicity to particular species, you know, that there are clear timings. If you've got hay fever, you know, each year it's going to be the miserable time is going to be March, or it's going to be April for you, depending on which specific tree and so on. So there are a range of topics, but the amount of research on the economic value of street trees in particular is now, I would say, huge. And so, you know, it opens up the opportunity to think more carefully about those issues, like which species, which populations, how are they going to change in the future. It's something we're looking at a lot. Thank you. Good question. Yeah.
Thanks. So we'll just continue with questions for Tom. So I had one. It's another one, but for you. But I have one. I'll interject here. So you started out by saying that, if I understood you correctly, that 0.1% of overseas investment or into climate adaptation went into cities. 0.1%. So that made me wonder, where does the other 99.9% end up if it's not in cities?
There were two figures. So it's 0.01% of climate finance is going into urban adaptation, and 0.1 of all finance is going into MBS, which includes rural. But between those two things, you're absolutely right, Thomas. Nearly all of the climate finance money is not going into MBS, and nearly all of the climate finance money for MBS is not going into cities. So my sense is going into existing forests, existing rural landscapes where fewer people are living. Like now, if you're from a catchment perspective, like myself, you will understand, and you are, Thomas, I know you deal in water, so you'll get it. The tree planting at the catchment scale will have a benefit for citizens. But there's a social justice issue there around the environment in which people live. and the very real impacts, multiple benefits, impacts that people find and feel from, you know, whether it's trees or other vegetation in the local environment. The difficulty seems to be articulating the economic case. It's more complex, and I've said it before in other projects, not just politicians, but people tend to believe simpler answers. And if the models are complex and the results are complex, it's much easier to articulate a case for a simpler setting where, like, you know, I mean, it's obvious, you can plant thousands of trees in a farmer's field much more easily than you can in a city centre.
So it's about buying the carbon credits, really. Is that it's an easy way of getting carbon credits?
Sadly, I'm afraid that's where we are, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Tom, here's another question for you. How accurate are the valuations for these nature-based solutions? And how do you, how is the reference taken to verify these valuations? How do you, so you value something, but how do you know it's actually a true valuation?
I think it depends partly on the methodologies. So, you know, some methods are more appropriate for certain scales. So, for instance, you know, willingness to pay is very helpful at the local site level, district level, perhaps. Hedonics becomes more powerful at the city scale. Whether that's believable in terms of results. So hedonics, basically, you're looking at things like house prices in relation to green space access, but the cause and effect might not be there. The mechanisms that deliver that investment, that benefit, might be linked as much with other factors that are happening, like, I don't know, tram stops or other economic developments. So I think I'm afraid the response to that is that it kind of depends on the setting and it depends on the methodology. I believe that peer review of publications is the most powerful way of dealing with this, and that's why we took the difficult decision not to include grey literature in the primary studies, and in a place like Latin America, that was a difficult choice. But I think sometimes you have to make those deal with those dilemmas. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, any more questions for Tom at this point? No. Well, I'll just change then. There's some questions for Louise, and she managed to interject my first question, which was about the concrete. So we'll strike that one out. Say okay. The other one, and several people have raised it, Louise, is do you know of similar experiences from implementing like living walls in freshwater systems?
I'm not personally aware of examples from freshwater systems, but I suspect it's happening. So somewhat this field is still so new. I'm aware of certain examples because my colleagues work in that area. But I was privy to a document recently that is. It's not based on scientific literature, it's more just actual on-the-ground projects. I suspect there are lots of things going on as we speak, but we're not aware of it. And it's only when the papers come out from it at a later date we'll become aware of it. So right now, I'm not aware of any living seawalls per se in river systems. But in terms of in the marine environment, yes, I think the living seawalls, there are two that are currently in the water. There's a full-scale one, obviously, in Sydney, many examples. We have ours in Plymouth, and ours is a full-scale example. If you look on their website, you will see dots in a few different places around the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are full-scale installations. These may be people who have purchased a handful of panels or a few examples and they have stuck them up. It doesn't mean that it's a full-scale installation, but there will be another one going in the water in Boston in summer 2024, and that again will be full-scale, and it will be a replica of one for comparison. I have been a member of a group called the World Harbour Project, which basically trialed and tested the exact same experiment in different harbours all over the world back from 2015 to 17. Many of the partners on that are sort of, still connected, and I suspect that they're the kind of people who will take this up. But it does require buy-in. Even with the World Harbour Project, we all had to have our own funding to purchase the tiles, install them and do it independently. It wasn't part of a nice, big, cohesive, global funded project. So having that buy-in, it does require people to have the money on the ground. And that's how it's working with the Living Seawall for the moment. I would really like to see some of those numbers that you talk about, Tom, turn into higher numbers that can help fund globally global installments of this kind of thing, because one of the biggest criticisms that I have of this field is papers get published from small scale short-term installations, and people probably oversell the results a little bit, and just because something works in an environment in Sydney, for instance, does not mean that it's going to have similar results in Plymouth, for instance. And also publishing something, and I'm guilty of this too, publishing something after 2 years, 3 years, we all know that ecological succession takes decades in many examples. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done, trialing these things in many different environments, but also over much longer timescales. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm hoping we'll see a lot more activity in this area, but it requires funding, and it requires coordinated funding at a high level.
Indeed, as much research do. But yeah, I guess the emphasis on freshwater was whether existing infrastructure, say bridges or flood walls, where it could be retrofitted to be more ecologically sensitive at the same time as
yes,
having their primary function as crossing a river or protecting somebody.
Yeah, there's been a bit of work done in the Thames. Robert Francis and Mike Chadwick from King's College London and Royal Holloway, that they've done a bit of work in the Thames looking at ecological enhancements there, but it doesn't involve living the panels like I'm suggesting.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the questions, unless somebody has wants to have a burning questions they would like to ask of any of the speakers while we have them. Now is your opportunity.
There was another question about bioblocks. For Louise, and if they've been used in cities, like the idea of sponge cities.
There are, so actually just 2 weeks ago, I saw in Dublin, I'm based in Ireland at the moment, there were bioblock type units, many of them deployed around the port of Dublin. So there's certainly a local example here in Ireland where there are many bioblocks positioned. I don't know about them being used in terms of sponge cities. By sponge cities, I'm assuming you mean like working with the soft infrastructure, so things like mangroves or salt marshes. I assume, am I correct? I don't know of them being used in that context, but certainly things like the bioblocks are being deployed. There's a company in Israel called eConcrete Tech, and they've certainly designed similar type units that have been deployed in many places around the world. But again, not that many. This is still quite a young field, but I suspect there's quite a lot going on as we speak. The papers just haven't come out yet.
Okay, thank you. I think there's no more questions, Prashant, so I think I'll pass back to you to tie up the webinar. Yes,
so thank you very much for both our speakers today. So this was the series of fantastic, the talks talking about the NBS valuation and the marine environment and the NBS, and these are the topics actually which still requires quite a lot of research. So thank you very much, both of you, for fantastic presentations and sharing the insight. And I was very glad to see the use of Reclaim support actually, building this strand of research. So thank you again, and thank you, Thomas, for sharing this session. And before we finish, I would like to introduce you to the two webinars we are, they're coming up. So that will be the webinar 24, 1st of May, the same time, 12:30 to 13:30, which is the first Wednesday of May. So our first speaker is Dr. Alessio Russo. He also won the funding from the Reclaim Network Plus for a large project. And he has moved now to Queensland University of Technology, and he will be talking about the project Rewilding Our City. So it's a very interesting project which was carried out in the UK, and I'm sure that there are lots of interesting findings you might want you to know about it. And the other webinar would be one of our co-investigators of the Reclaim Network Plus, Professor Lauren Jones, and he'll be talking with Dr. Stefano Barcisi. They both come from the UKCH, I presume, and they'll be talking about the new toolkit for ecosystem service site-based assessment. So I think they're going to be very interesting presentations. So I would encourage you to attend and share these, the upcoming webinar in your network. Just to finish, actually, so we have got the Reclaim conference coming up, which is on 23rd of May, and that is going to be happening at the Barbican Centre in London. So you are most welcome. If you have not registered yet, it's free to register, so please register and share with your colleagues, and we will put the link in the chat box for your ready reference. There is another very exciting thing happening at the moment, which is the photographic completion of the urban green and blue infrastructure. If you have taken any interesting photos, then just use the link again. We will put in the chat box, and there's an opportunity to win £400 for the best picture. So, and this is not really a work actually. So if you're really the nature lover, you might find some interesting spaces, and you can take the pictures and you can submit your entry to the Reclaim photography competition, which is open internationally. And we got quite a lot of entries so far, and the deadline for that is 26th of April. So we still got 2 weeks to go. Last but not the least, actually, if you are not the member of the Reclaim Network, you can become the network member by simply filling a form. There are no costs associated with it. You could visit the Reclaim Network website, and you can become the member and start getting the information, all these opportunities which Reclaim is providing. You can also follow us on X, which is the latest version of Twitter, and the LinkedIn, where we keep posting actually the opportunities and the activities of the network. We will be looking forward to see you in the next webinar and in the upcoming the conference and so on. So thank you very much, everyone, again, and have a nice rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.